Hello, welcome to AOSC 661 Sustainability Modeling for Spring 2015. This is lecture number 1, and it is essentially an introduction to the class.
Let's see what the contents of this lecture are. I think I'll tell you a little bit about this class in more detail, besides what you may have already know. We'll look at some sustainability concepts and a little history behind the whole concept of sustainability and the reason for modeling within the sustainability context. So we'll do a little bit of understanding of why modeling and specifically why modeling sustainability, and we'll go through some initial examples.
So let me tell you a little bit about this class. We'll talk about the rationale, why this class, why take this class. We'll go through the syllabus in some detail today. We'll talk about the class logistics. This class it's being taught for the first time in this format that's a little bit hybrid with class lectures supported by videos and online material. And some of the tools that we're going to be using to deliver the contents of the class. So let's talk a little bit about the rationale for the class. This class is essentially experimental in nature, and by that we mean that we are not only introducing or integrating concepts of sustainability into a single class, but it's also the format that will be taught and the tools that we'll use to go through the topics. I developed this class with the philosophy that it would be a modeling class for students with non-modeling backgrounds. And what I mean by that is that I'm essentially using sustainability as a topic to teach modeling. And because people that do sustainability come from non-modeling backgrounds, I wanted to have this class that would actually serve that audience. So sustainability is being used as a means for the class, not an end in itself. So this is not a class on sustainability per se, but it's a class on modeling that uses sustainability as a means to teach you some models. And you will learn how to deal with sustainability in a more quantitative sense by doing this. I see this class as contributing to the evolving field of sustainability science, so being a component of it.
Let's move on to the syllabus. The course synopsis that I put in, I hate these wordy slides, but I just wanted to capture some key words in the course synopsis that I offered in the course syllabus that was circulated earlier. Really, this class it's for students who are concerned with sustainability issues. Okay, so that's it's first and foremost the first interest has to be on sustainability issues. You can get a modeling class in other topics elsewhere. So this is going to be a modeling class on sustainability matters or issues. And we're going to be honing in on understanding what modeling can do to help solve sustainability problems. Okay, so modeling is going to be a tool to solve these problems. We're going to be focusing very much on quantitative understanding. So this is really a class about crunching numbers and understanding what these numbers mean and understanding where these numbers come from and understanding the way these numbers are arrived at, how they may vary under different assumptions. And a lot of the modeling is going to be directed at designing, policy measures. So it's really, one nice feature of the way I've tried to design this class is that I want to go from the modeling and from the mathematics and number crunching to really cross the bridge to designing policy measures that affect these sustainability issues. To do that, we're going to be using something that's been around for a few decades, at least in formal form, which is system dynamics or system dynamics theory. I'm going to be using tools that will allow you to get hands-on knowledge of these tools and how they're used. My aim with this class is that it's a class that's open to students of all backgrounds. So is not for students that have a purely a scientific or natural science background, or purely policy background, or purely modeling background. I think it's a class that has mass appeal, and hopefully that'll be the outcome. So let's see if we can get there this semester. It'll be very, very interesting. Let me move on to the learning objectives. These are also detailed in the syllabus, but I wanted to highlight and explain a little bit of what's behind them. I think first and foremost, it's about introducing students to key issues in sustainability, not isolate them and in of themselves, but actually how they interact with each other. So this is really about understanding these interactions and understanding them at different scales, and we'll look at issues that go from local to regional to global scales, and different issues will be approached from any of these scales. I think the next piece is that we're going to be analyzing these interactions from, again, quantitatively. We're going to be focusing on really on number crunching quantities, and trying to understand what's behind these numbers. We're going to be using models to handle interdisciplinary data. This is data that comes from different disciplines in sustainability, and using system dynamics modeling as a tool for this integration of data. I think one piece that hasn't been mentioned and I wanted to emphasize is also to understand the limitations of these models and these tools, not only because of assumptions that we make, but also because there's a lot of uncertainty in the data and in the issues themselves. So I think again, we're going to be trying to quantify what this uncertainty is. At least it's one thing to know that you don't know something, but at least if you don't know what it is, but you do know that it's within some uncertainty range, then you have a much better idea of how to handle it. And we're going to be, looking at this with a series of examples in a series of topics. Okay, so that's sort of the the learning objectives, looking at the interaction, quantitative, interdisciplinary, system dynamics modeling, and uncertainty.
In the syllabus for the class, I go over topic by topic of what we're going to be covering in each lecture. However, I want to give you a quick rundown of what we're going to be covering in the class. Today is an introduction to the class, and we'll continue that through this week. A little bit of motivation of why this class is needed, why is it useful. Next week, we're going to be looking at modeling as a discipline and how modeling as a tool can be used to address sustainability issues. So it'll be a general introduction to modeling as well. Then we're going to start getting into specific sustainability issues, and the one to start with will be the human triggered population and how that starts most sustainability issues. Then we're going to see how humans interact. We're going to be looking at social interactions and how these aggregate and impact sustainability issues. Then we're going to start looking at human-nature interactions and how that interface sort of shapes most sustainability problems. The economic angle to sustainability is key, so we're going to be introducing some economic variables into the mix of modeling, how that distills some potential avenues to analyze sustainability issues. Then we're going to tackle issues like the climate and climate change, and how that has brought some new light and some new pressures on sustainability. We're going to talk about water as a resource and water as a key element in sustainability matters. When we're looking at energy and how that impacts and how it mixes up with all these other resources. We are also going to be looking at food and food production, and how these are linked and how are these connections made. We're going to be looking at disease and how sustainability and disease are related. We are going to be looking at biodiversity issues and how it's connected to sustainability as well. We're going to go then to look at answer this age-old question of whether there are limits to growth, and it's an interesting debate. By this time in the class, we'll have enough elements to have an educated debate and recognize some of the elements on sort of both sides of the answer, on the multiple sides of the answer to that question, probably. And then we're going to close the class by looking at sustainability as an integrated topic, and how all these variables that we have been discussing in each of the lectures, how they come together to try to answer, sort of the big, problems of the world, poverty and food production and how society can hold itself together over time. One of the aspects I'm sure you're interested in learning about is how this class is going to be graded. And grading of this class is going to be a combination of 4 items. We will have a midterm exam, and this won't really be an exam. Will be actually you'll be asked to write a blog post, and we're going to be publishing that blog post on the site. And I'll be grading you not only on the quality of the post itself, but also on the interactions, the comments that you make on your fellow colleagues' posts. So it'll be a good way to gauge not only what you write, but also how you interact with each other. We're going to have a term paper, which will be essentially on a topic of your choice. You're going to be developing a system dynamics model to simulate that, and I'll give you indications as to the format and how that's going to be done. There'll be a final exam. The final exam is essentially going to be the presentation of your term paper. So these two essentially are going to be combined for the class. And then we'll have a class discussion and participation, which will be arranged through our online mechanism for interaction. And in previous offerings of this class, I used Facebook to get a discussion page, and there were some concerns about using Facebook because of people sort of wanted to keep their social from their classwork separate. So I decided to go to LinkedIn this time, which is a very nice tool because it allows you to essentially interact with networks of professionals. So we'll have a LinkedIn group. LinkedIn also has a nice feature that allows you to publish blogs and op-eds, which is sort of ties into the first part of the grading of the class. So we're going to be I'll chat with you about how we're going to be setting up this LinkedIn discussion group. Let's talk about class logistics. So this class will be taught through a combination of in-classroom and online lectures. So we will likely, for most weeks, will be meeting Mondays in class. Wednesdays we won't meet unless directed otherwise, but you are expected to spend time with the online materials. We will also have a combination of in-classroom and online discussions, and this is going to play into that discussion part of your grade. I'll make all class materials, that means the lectures, videos, readings, will be available for viewing anytime in a dedicated Dropbox folder that we'll create for this class, that hasn't been created for this class, but also through the LinkedIn page. And I will also be posting all the instructions for the classes, for the deadlines, also through the LinkedIn and through the Dropbox mediums.
Approach. Let's talk now a little bit about sustainability. And it's you've probably taken another class on sustainability. If you haven't, I thought it would be a good idea anyway to try to define what sustainability is. And so sustainability is, and I picked up a few definitions that I found on dictionaries and on the web. The capacity to endure. Well, it's kind of a general definition, which is fine. Probably not my favorite. A more traditional one that I found was a method of harvesting or using a resource so that the resource is not depleted or permanently damaged, which starts getting at the relationship between using a resource and the state of the resource uh, in the future. Okay, and that's a little bit of what I want to talk about. Um, Now, the definition that I found: the quality of not being harmful to the environment or depleting natural resources, and thereby supporting long-term ecological balance. Again, you can start seeing, a couple of emerging things here. One is the use of a resource, and second is it's the time issue. How, what are going to be the impacts of that use into the future. The definition I sort of continue to like the most is the definition that was put forth by the United Nations in the late 80s, um, which sounds something like meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So I think the key items that need to be captured here is that there is a relationship between resource use in the present, resource use in the future, and satisfying needs in the present and in the future. And the balance of all that is what it's this concept, this elusive concept that we've referred to as sustainability. So it's not a static concept, but it's a concept that has evolved over time and that will continue to evolve over time. Okay. Um, so I want to do a little bit of history, and I want to look at the work that I consider to be the sort of the first attempt to formally pose the questions of whether humanity, our world, our lives were sustainable in a more or less quantitative fashion. So it's not just about posing the question. That tends to be posing questions, and in the context has been done, but posing questions and trying to answer them in a quantitative way has not been done that frequently, particularly not in sustainability. And so the first of those works was the work of the Reverend Thomas Malthus, and we'll talk a little bit about that, about Malthusian analysis. We'll look at the historically what followed that in the agricultural agrarian revolution that took place, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, and we'll look also at that a little bit more detail later on when we discuss food production. Um, the the issue of the tragedy of the commons, which was a piece of seminal work that came about that really tackled um, uh, the notion of the use of a common resource, and the different approaches that I can take, and that was a very interesting piece of work that was published in the late 1960s, based on some historical data that had been gathered for a couple of centuries. Then we'll talk a little bit about this study in the 1970s that it would be probably what I would call the first attempt to look at sustainability from a modeling standpoint. So not just quantitatively like Malthus did, but actually using computational models and system dynamics tools. And this was the limits to growth study that was published in the 1970s. And then we'll move on just to introduce some of the, what I call the today issues, and we talked a little bit about these in the syllabus: water, food, energy, and the economy. So let's move on to the study of the work of Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was a reverend who in 18th century, well, late 18th century, beginning of 19th century England, published a series of works that became known for his concerns about population growth and sustainability. So I would say that this is perhaps the first work to tackle what we know as sustainability today, and I think that's fairly accurate to say this. He authored the essay on the principle of population, and there were 6 editions of this report or this essay that were published between 1798 and 1826. Um, and and Malthus' central issue was the unequal nature of food supply to population growth, or our ability to produce food to feed the population as it was growing. Um, this of course centered in what we would call today the exponential or geometric growth versus the linear or arithmetic growth. And if you think about it very simply, um, let's take a look at a couple of graphs. The first graph just um, sort of shows what exponential growth looks like versus linear growth. And exponential growth, essentially, it's growth that is multiplied or that's dependent on the number of population that's present. So let's say, very simply, if at the very beginning there was one person, this person, or actually there should be 2 people so they can reproduce. They have a number of children. Let's say they have 2 children. So the first generation produces 2, but each of these 2 is able to produce 2 more. And then what you start having is that you have an accelerated growth curve, which is the blue curve there on the left. That's referred to as exponential, and that is referred to population. Malthus argued that food production was at best going to be able to follow a linear growth model, meaning that it will essentially, if technology in food production would allow food to grow over time, such that the amount of food produced per year would increase by a constant amount. Okay, so that was Malthus' assumption, and that's what's called linear food production or linear growth for food. So Malthus' concern was that essentially we're going to be running this into a situation where even if like the growth, if you look at the curve on the right, even if the linear curve it's for time, it's higher than the exponential curve of population. At some point, the population growth was going to overtake our ability to produce food, and we would crash. So that was essentially the concern. Now this concern today we understand that was driven by the assumption that food production would follow this linear growth model. What's interesting, it was published in 1798, and I have here a little picture of the cover page of the original study, but you can actually see the whole study in some of these links. The first 2 links cover the entire essay. The third link there that I encourage you to see is a nice summary of the history and what how that study by Malthus was actually taken up by the how it was criticized and what happened with it over time. So now, needless to say, Malthusian analysis and the Malthusian predicament was sort of it had a high impact when it happened in the beginning of the 19th century, but then this agricultural revolution sort of came about, and what started happening is that there were changes introduced around the world in the 18th and 19th century that allowed agriculture and food production to grow at a much faster rate that Malthus had predicted. So this created sort of a backlash towards the Malthusian predictions, the Malthusian judgments that that population was going to overtake food production, and we're all going to die, that the world had no future, and we start living for a couple of centuries, start living in ages where that saw a lot of progress, a big part of that progress was in food production and this agricultural revolution. The changes that were introduced were, anything from new crops to rotation of crops, so you could use the same piece of land and have several harvests of several crops during the year, so as to keep production going. It was not just a bimodal in which you would grow part of the year and then the rest of the year not. Um, the introduction of new and improved breeds of crops, um, infrastructure, better buildings to store and to conserve food, drainage purposes, better ways to have irrigation, more efficient irrigation, so that the per land unit production of crops could grow. The use of fertilizers, new implements became new um, you know, became new ways to accelerate food production. So this had backlash on the whole Malthusian theory that was based on essentially the fact that food production was tapped out, or the rate of food production was tapped out. This agricultural revolution demonstrated that, essentially innovation and improvements could really turn things around and ameliorated that concern of population. Um, and this actually revolution, went well into the 20th century. And especially in the 1960s, there was a sort of another big expansion with high yield varieties of cereals and more irrigation, better irrigation infrastructure, better management, synthetic fertilizers. So the chemical industry took off and really created this uh, powerful growth of food production that really, through the predictions that Malthus had made at the beginning of the 19th century, completely away, because there were about 100, 150, 160 years went by where the world saw a really large growth in the food production, and completely quelch these concerns of competition with population growth. Um, so that sort of went away, and I think what happened as a result is that population growth really took off exponentially. And if you look at that population growth curve, the exponential, you can see that as time progresses, the slope starts getting steeper and steeper. So we really started growing as a population very, very fast. So this gets us into the 1970s or thereabouts, or sort of the 60s and 70s, when we started looking again at the data and saying, yes, population is growing very fast, and yes, food production has also grown fast, and we're going back into a situation where we should start thinking about how to balance these two. And it was interesting that for over 200 years of history, sustainability was the competition between population growth and food production. We'll see today, and we'll start seeing in this class, that there are a whole host of other issues that are involved. Now, this late 60s to the tragedy of the commons, and this is a study that was published in 1968 by a let's see, the classical paper by Harding in 1968. But actually, the studies was conducted, or this work focused on villages in England before 1750, and in those days, these villages had large nearby areas that belonged to the village. Okay, and these common areas were not held in any sort of private ownership, but members of the village could raise their sheep on their land and also and often released their extra sheep to the commons. And the idea was that, you know, I'll feed the sheep with my resources, but there's a common pool also that I can use, and there's really no one stopping me from doing it. Um, so these users reasoned that even if their animals on the commons did not grow well, because of overconsumption of the grass, any growth was a benefit that would have not otherwise have materialized. So whatever happened outside in the commons was extra. But what happened is that if everybody starts doing that and everybody starts consuming from the commons, um, in an uncontrolled and uncoordinated way, then the outcome of that, and that's what Harding shows in his paper, is that essentially this results in the collapse of the commons and essentially the death of all the sheep. So it's what it's called the tragedy of the commons, and it was an interesting study because it gave some theoretical basis to the approach of use of resources by individuals in different ways, in a sort of an individualistic way, you know, every person on its own, or in a collective way in which, and this started putting some theoretical meat on the science of sustainability, so to speak. So I would say that, you know, in addition to the work by Malthus, then this tragedy of the commons work was a second major piece, and it took up, you know, like I said, took a couple hundred years to get from one to the other, almost 170 years actually, to get from one to the other. Now there's a nice video that I encourage you to see, and I'll let you watch that on your own. I'll post this video as well on our YouTube page that has a very nice explanation of the issue of the tragedy of the commons that I encourage you to see. And we're going to come back as well to this when we discuss economics and social behavior and how we model that. Okay. The next piece of work has to do. It was very shortly thereafter, from the tragedy of the commons work, and was the limits to growth publication. And this was a study that was commissioned by the Club of Rome, which is an international think tank that was founded in the 60s, and it's still in existence today. It was really the first study of its kind, in that it attempted to computationally simulate global sustainability issues. So to me, this is the limits to growth study of 1972, the first edition, became this was essentially 40 years ago. It became the first attempt to try to simulate what would happen in the world under different scenarios of growth. Okay, to use this, the researchers developed a model that was referred to as the World 3. I have never quite found out if there was ever a World 1 or 2, but all I know is that there's model World 3 that actually still exists, and I'll tell you a little bit about it today. The study became quite controversial because I think, unfortunately, and this is just my opinion, I think it focused more on the policy implications. Only the outside of the study got a look. Okay, so I think people sort of read, how like what I like to say, people went straight to the conclusions of the report, read only those couple of pages, and then never really stopped to understand what was behind it. And I think that there was a lot, that the most valuable piece of work, and the reason that the limits to growth, in my opinion, has had such an impact, and probably the reason that no other study to date has had that same impact is because of what was inside, the methods that were used, and the potential for it. And much of what we'll be learning in this class has its roots in the science that was developed for this limits to growth study. Now, interestingly, and we'll see that in this class in a few lectures time, This study was followed by what was referred to as a 30-year update. So the same scientists sort of got together in 2000 or thereabouts and looked at, well, so we predicted 30 years ago this was going to happen. What has actually happened? And then try to see what what was right and what was wrong and why, etc. And actually, it turned out that a lot of the trends that were identified were right on the money, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Um, so I want to talk briefly some more about the World 3 model because it's really it's the kind of tool that we're going to be looking at. We're not going to be simulating the whole world. We'll probably tackle some more specific issues, but the science that's there, it's really the kind of approach that we'll be using, with the corresponding updates that have taken place over, the past 40 years. But this model essentially used a set of five quantitative variables to understand what was happening in the world and what would likely happen in the world under different scenarios. And the first variable is population. Okay, so these are quantitative variables. So these are variables that can be quantified and can be used to understand the state of the world. So population of the world is one key variable that tells us where the world is. Capital is another variable. This is the sort of the amount of capital. This has to do not just with money, but also with infrastructure, services, and the amount of capital that exists in the world. Food, okay, again, we go back to food production as one of the key variables that drives sustainability. The state of non-renewable resources, okay, and how use of these resources to live and to produce capital and to generate food and to grow population is used. And then, a side effect of growth, which is pollution. And the limit to growth study, the World 3 model, had sort of a pollution variable in there to account for the fact that population growth and capital growth and food production and resource depletion led to a measure of degradation of the surrounding environment, which was referred to as pollution. So those were the five variables that were used in this study. Okay, so let me show you just typically what the output of this model looks like, and I hope the curves are clear, but you can see in the graph there are five curves, and there's a time horizon between 1900 and 2100. So what they did was that they looked at what had happened in the world between 1900 and 1970, which is where they cut off the data to develop the models. And then they looked at what would happen between 1970 and the next 130 years until 2100. Okay, and they have these five variables, and you can see here essentially how each of these variables behaves. And I just have some snippets as to how these variables behave. The first one is that the limited resource pool is exhausted. So you can see that the resources curve drops between abundance in 1900, or that was the starting resource pool in 1900, and then in 200 years you essentially consume all the resources. You can see that that food production grows essentially at the beginning due to resource availability. So there's resource available, there's technology, so you can use water and you can use energy to produce food. But after these resources start being depleted, then the ability to produce food decreases, and that's sort of the collapsing part of the system that this study shares with the work of Malthus. Population also can grow because of resource and the food availability. So there's resources, there's food production, so people can grow. But of course, when resources start running out and food production starts slowing down, then population also starts decreasing. And industrial pollution industrial output and pollution pretty much follow the same trend. There's a while there's resources and there's population, industrial output, this capital will grow. There'll be more machines. There'll be more production of other things, but that generates pollution, and both of those grow, of course, as again, because the resource pool is being shut down and the resources go essentially decrease to a point where there's pretty much not available anymore. Eventually capital output and pollution itself, die away. There's a little bit of a lag on pollution because the underlying assumption here is that pollution probably takes some time to develop or at least to be noticed in the system. So that's the overall gist of it. So this is the kind of thing, the kind of analysis that this World 3 model allowed to do. It allowed to look at these 5 variables in an interlocking relationship with each other. So these variables don't operate independently. They are very much interactive with each other, and how the collective of the 5 of them would evolve in a period of 200 years. Okay, so that was the value that I see in this study. Unfortunately, as I said, I think people focused more on the sort of the 2100 result and saying, oh, so you're saying we're all going to die, that food's going to go away, population is going to go away. So so that's sort of the it's like Malthus. It's sort of discredited, or people didn't pay too much attention to it. But there's a lot of value in how, in tying these variables together and seeing how they interacted. The nice thing about models, and the World 3 is no exception, is that it allows us to look at what if scenarios. What if we started with a world that had twice as many resources as we have now? So what would that do? And essentially, so let's say an example is what like it has happened. What if we discover more oil reserves, or we have better ways to access groundwater and minerals? Okay, so there's more resources, and in this particular simulation of the model, there were twice as the base simulation that was presented before, so more resources. And essentially what happens is that the resource availability actually delays the decreasing limb of population. So it's still, even if you have twice as many resources, and that's what the model simulated, even if you have twice as many resources, you end up in a situation where resources are going to be depleted. Of course, they get depleted later on, so there's a delay. But nonetheless, if there's a delay in resource availability, there'll be also a decrease in associated population, food, and industrial output. Okay, so it's sort of the same finding. It's just that it happens later because you have more resources. It's like having more money in your bank account and then losing your job. You're going to be able to sort of live off longer, but eventually, if you don't find a job, the situation won't be sustainable. So that's a little bit of the same assumption. Now, in this particular case, resources are not wiped out completely. You can see actually that at the end, the resource pool sort of picks up, but it is severely depleted compared to its initial abundance. So this scenario, twice as many resources, indicates that you're still headed for an unsustainable output or outcome, but it just happens later. Okay, so that's sort of the 5-second version of it. So, well, then they push the envelope even further. So what happens if we have a world with unlimited resources? This means that resources are there. You have a vast pool. Okay, Um, and in this case, you essentially you have sort of infinite resources, but they're still consumed. So you're still consuming them. Um, and Now, what happens if you have infinite resources is that you start. It's this is where the trade-off comes in. If you have infinite resources, you're able to produce a lot more food. You're able to produce a lot more industrial output. Population is able to grow more, but then pollution takes off. So you generate enormous amounts of pollution, and then that in turn um, affects because it increases the death rate of population. So if there's more pollution, the assumption is that more pollution will affect population growth because it will increase the risk of death of population. People will get sick because the water is polluted, the air is polluted. Um, so population actually is indeed affected by it. And and look at the industrial output and food production towards the end, where they really start increasing. I want to ask you to think about that and answer why that happens. I want you to comment on the group page on that question. Okay, you got to think a little bit about this dynamics, but I want to more intuitively try to make you think about this. Okay. Well, then they looked at a whole variety of scenarios. So they had a world with unlimited resources, but pollution control. So this is a world where the resource pool was very large and there were pollution controls. So pollution could not go above certain value. So there was maybe a technology or some technological innovation that would allow uh, for um, for pollution to be kept in check. Um, so essentially, the outcome of this is that the population grows more, the food availability becomes scarcer because now you have population growing uncontrollably because there's nothing to impede it. There's plenty of resources, there's plenty of food because you can produce it, and but as population starts growing, it will overtake food production capability. Um, and then as you consume these resources, then it becomes harder to produce industrial capital output, and eventually things go down. And pollution eventually, I mean, it will the fact that it's controlled doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It will occur, but it'll just occur much slower. Um, and and then there's another scenario at the right, which is the same, unlimited resources, pollution controls, but then increased agricultural productivity. So this is the scenario in which you're able to produce more food with the same resources. Okay, and it essentially sort of exacerbates these trends. So it's sort of the same, a little bit of the same output. It's just that it's a little bit more accentuated these trends. So what happens if you have unlimited resources, pollution controls, and now you have birth control? So you have a way to control population by regulating the birth rate of population. Okay, that's the scenario on the left. And the scenario on the right is the same, but it has the increased agricultural productivity, so more food production. So the outcome of this is that because population is controlled, um, food production and industrial output per person grow very fast. But then pollution also, it's even if you have it controlled, it will grow because you're generating more food, you're generating more output. Industrial activity generates pollution, um, and essentially all this growth of food production and industrial production drive down resource availability. Okay, so essentially resources are depleted in both cases. Um, and then the nice thing is that you can start looking at all these different scenarios, and these two I think are a little bit unrealistic because these are scenarios in which you have what's called a stabilized population. So this is a situation where um, by some magical rule you're able to say, okay, so we will grow world population to this level and stop. Okay. Um, but it's useful to just look at the outcomes, and the outcomes of this, it's that um, the pollution is kept in check, because the growth is limited, but the ability to produce food is limited by resources, so that's another um, another outcome of this. And both are pretty much the same. Um, then they looked at what's called a stabilized world model, and again, stabilization is brought about by controlling population, which I think is completely unrealistic. Um, and now industrial output and food production are kept efficient over time, and and independent of resources and better technologies. So that's a piece of it. Um, Now, by depleting less resources, then pollution is kept in check. But again, these are sort of unrealistic scenarios, and I think, in retrospect, considering these scenarios, I think subtracted a little bit of credibility to the study, and I would have, I probably would have, even if I included, maybe I would include just one for the sakes of showing, but nothing else. Unfortunately, they went into a stabilized world model 2. And in this model, it's characterized by introducing birth control and better technologies for food and industrial production in 1975 on the left simulation, and 2000 in the right side simulation. Um, and the outcomes of this is that pollution is kept in check, and resource depletion is curbed. But this 25-year delay in policy implementation, which is what they wanted to show, is the delay of implementing these policies. Delay stabilization. So I think that was and those were the major scenarios run in the World 3 model. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the kinds of things, the kinds of topics that we're going to be discussing. And I wanted to start the intuitive introduction of system dynamics by using some very simple examples initially. Um, and I'll talk about your bank account, your or my bank account, your personal bank account. I'll talk about your body weight. I'll talk about population growth, so we'll look at more of a collective variable. I'll talk about water in a lake and the global economy. Okay, so let's try to tackle these issues. Let's look at your bank account, and your bank account, essentially, if you think about what you look quantitative for in your bank account, it's essentially the amount of money that's stored in your bank account. Okay, now that amount of money in your bank account is not a static variable. It's a variable that changes over time. It changes over time because you have inputs of money, and those may come through income or deposits into your account, but you also have outputs, and these can be expenses, investments, any other money that comes out. And then internally within the account, you have essentially also inputs and outputs that are dependent on the amount of money that's there. And I want to make the distinction, and we'll make this more clear later on, about inputs and outputs that are dependent on the variable itself and those that are not. And for the most part, your income and your deposits may be, for the most part, may be independent. Your salary, it's not really dependent on the amount of money you have in your bank account. But if you look at other sort of, like interest and fees and charges, they're add or subtract from bank account, those might be dependent on the amount of money that you have. Now, if you add all these things up, what you have in there plus what comes out minus what comes out, then you have an idea of how that bank account quantity variable is changing over time. Okay, so I want to keep that notion in terms of this particular example. Another simple one is your body. And the body weight is also another quantitative variable that you keep track of, and that is the body mass or your weight. Okay, now your body weight, again, not a static variable. It will have it be influenced by inputs, like food, and outputs like excretions or surgery. I don't know if you do a liposuction or something, or whatever it is. A little bit crass example, but there also will be these within inputs and outputs that are dependent on your body mass, like your exercise or your diet. You and I have different body weights, and if you go out there and run 4 miles, and if I go out there and run 4 miles, the outputs are not going to be the same, just because it is that output is going to be dependent on the specific body mass, and I'm simplifying things a little bit, but you get the idea. Again, another system where you have a quantitative variable that's affected by inputs and outputs, and thus it varies over time. Okay. Next one, a little bit less individual, is population growth. So let's say you're looking at a city, a country, a state, or and your variable is the number of people. Okay. Well, number of people is not, or not, the population in city, state, country, whatever entity, it's not a static variable. It will be affected by inflows, and the inflows could be net migration, positive or negative. It could be a net migration into the location or out of the location, and the output of that, or the is deaths that are related to anything that has to do with accidents or just people dying naturally, and then there's of course the births and deaths that occur naturally within the system. Okay, so again, the balance of these inputs and outputs will give you the dynamic changes in population. Okay, and we're going to be looking at these in a fair amount of detail in this class, but I wanted to sort of plant in your brains the sort of the logic of this. Okay, this sort of adding inputs and outputs and trying to see how those change over time. If you look at water in a lake, it's the same reasoning. The quantity you're likely to look for is the volume of water in that lake. And that's affected by inputs, and primarily those are going to be rainfall. There might be other inputs as well, and there'll be outputs like infiltration through the ground. There'll be runoff discharges to rivers or to the ocean from the lake, and then there'll be primarily an output that depends on the amount of water in the lake, and that's evaporation. So the evaporation depends on the amount of water in the lake. So if I want to keep track of this quantitative variable of water in the lake, I need to look at all these inputs and outputs and see how they shake up. Okay. Let's look at agricultural production, another one. So in this case, the quantitative variable should be would be the agricultural products, and this could be tons of corn or tons of wheat that are produced or that are that are present in a farm or in a state. Again, it depends on the system, and there'll be inputs, inputs such as land and fertilizers, or outputs, which is the amount of food that's generated, that's produced, and it's driven, it's sold to the markets, or it's distributed to some supply chain. And then there's the decay or the loss. A fraction of the crops are lost to naturally to weather issues, or to decay, natural decay. So again, the balance of these inputs and outputs will tell you a little bit about how agricultural production will evolve over time. Want to move into something bigger and better? Let's look at the global economy. Well, I sort of put this in there, but I was just kidding. We're really not ready for this one just yet. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. And there's a useful lesson here. So we need to start small and start by looking at small systems. your body weight, your bank account, population of a small system, and see how that changes before, understand those before we move on to understanding larger systems. Okay, so let's just not get ahead of ourselves. I threw it in there just to generate a reaction. Now, of course, you can pretty much appreciate that these systems are not independent. So if you look at at water and energy and other issues, they're connected. And so if you have let's take the population system that we just looked at, and we looked at the water in the lake, other system we looked at, and we can think of these two systems interacting. So for example, um, the volume of water, the availability of that water, if the water feeds the population, um, it will have an impact on the health of the people, which will affect births and deaths. So if you have good quality water, plenty available, you have capability of having more births. But if you have little water available or poor quality, then you have more potential for death. So there's a connection between these two systems through health. There could be another connection. The number of people affect evaporation through essentially development. More people, the more roads, the more infrastructure you need. That affects that decreases the evaporation, the natural evaporation of the system, and you sort of alter the cycling of water. Okay, so you generate a balance there. Um, and other events such as excessive runoff, natural disasters of flood can affect, have an impact on creating additional deaths in the system that will affect population. So you can see how these systems become connected, and they're not really independent or completely independent of each other. And part of our job in this class is to find not only what these connections are, but how we quantify them. Okay, so we're going to be looking at these. And we can actually connect more systems. Let's take the two systems that are connected now, and then look at another subsystem that we looked at, the agricultural production, and we can say, well, um, the availability of water through either infiltration or runoff will affect the land availability for it. So, for example, if you flood a piece of land, it won't be available for harvest of a crop, and you sort of affect agricultural production. The amount of food feeds directly into the number of people that can be supported. So that's another connection between these systems. And the variety or the ability of agricultural production to grow may attract or detract migration. And that's a common problem in many countries where mass migration, mass migrant workers um, move between one country and the next, or one city and the next, to work on the fields and agriculture. It's a big interaction that happens worldwide. So you can see that how these systems start connecting, how the influences, the mutual interactions, and these mutual influences are not trivial to predict offhand. And this is one of the reasons why we need modeling. So my pitch for why do we need modeling? First of all, we need to be quantitative. In order to design effective policies, we need to understand quantitatively what's going on. We need to be able to forecast, even if we're wrong, and more forecasts are wrong. The ability to forecast does point you in the direction of a trend that might enable you to launch a policy, or to implement a policy, or to make decisions that are important. I think another key use of modeling is assimilating data. So there is data that's collected, and models allow you to use that data to essentially analyze it and extract results. Anything from the simplest, like a linear regression, which is a tool that most of you might be familiarized with. That's a model in itself. And models are really thinking aids. Okay, in this class, for the most part, we're not going to be looking to models as as predictors, but more as thinking aids. And one piece of advice that I give you now is that it is best to never use the word prediction when you refer to a model, because you're going to be wrong no matter what. But actually, models are not really intended, or at least the models we're going to be discussing here, are not intended to predict. They're intended more to help us think, to analyze data, to forecast. And forecast has a big uncertainty to it that we'll discuss. And models give us the ability to be quantitative, but not really to predict. So I want to sort of take that word out of the vocabulary in this class right now, as a piece of advice. Okay. Now, for this class, we're going to be using a piece of software that's called Vensim, and I've already asked you to download it and install it, and we'll spend a couple of sessions learning how to use it and using it to set up our models. But it's the gist of it is that it's a tool that's easy to use in assembling and running system dynamics models, and as well as analyzing the simulation results. Okay. Now, it's not the only piece of software that's available, but it has, in my opinion, it has a very simple interface that's easy to learn very quickly, and it's also free of charge for classroom use, and that's a big criteria right there. So I'm not going to deny that, and you can look at some background on the tool itself here for some history and background of the tool, and we're going to be looking at that more closely. So we're getting to the end of this lecture, and so I want to look ahead at what we're going to be doing next. Next, we're going to be formally introducing the discipline of system dynamics modeling. So we're going to be, looking at this modeling concept from a little bit more formally and more accurately. We're going to explain the purposes of modeling, so a little bit more detail of what we explained today, and we're going to work on understanding the components of a system dynamics model, and gradually building a system dynamics model. So we're going to be looking at these systems that we've described: water, food, energy, population, and we're going to gradually start building simple system dynamics models and then more complex. So hopefully this would allow us to get a grasp not only on the modeling technique itself, but also as to how integrating these pieces through modeling will shed some light on the questions of sustainability, which we will be posing continuously. So that is pretty much it. I am going to, like I said, I'm going to upload, well, actually, if you've seen this, I've already uploaded it, but this lecture will be uploaded. It will be there on the Dropbox folder in our Facebook page for you to see and you to look at. You can go back and forth, and you can ask any questions on the discussion forum. So it's been a pleasure, and I'll talk to you next time. Thanks very much. Au revoir. Enjoy the rest of the week.
And just for some closing items today for this lecture, I wanted to reiterate that we'll have a class discussion group on LinkedIn, and you can actually click on the link here in yellow, and that'll take you to the LinkedIn group page. There'll also be a class Dropbox folder also on that link, in which you can access all class materials anytime. And as an assignment for this first lecture, I want to ask each of you to join the class LinkedIn group, look at or access the Dropbox folder, and report back. By reporting back, I mean don't call me, don't email me, that'll be too easy. I want you to post it on the LinkedIn page that you've joined. That way I know you're there. So thanks for joining today's lecture, and I'll see you next time.